Okay, welcome to East Asia Adventures, starring Phil and Luke. Today we're going to be talking about housing.
Talking about housing, you say?
That's right, that's where you live. It's where everybody who lives in houses lives, and other things related to that. So yeah, that's the topic.
Okay.
Because one thing that I know is quite different between both China and Japan and the United States is houses are not the kind of thing that you live in for 100 years and you never move into a house that was built in the 30s. Yeah, there's a bit of a difference there.
So where do we start?
I guess I can talk about Japan's housing a little bit.
Okay.
One thing that surprised me, traveling around even this rural part of Japan, is the number of houses that don't look like anyone lives inside them. There's just empty houses. And I was like, why are these houses empty? And I guess people don't like to live in used houses here, which is a weird concept to me. It's like, used? I mean, okay, I guess. So if you look at the history of Japan, World War II destroyed most of the houses. Not most, but it destroyed a ton of houses. So then in the 40s, they built, or late 40s, and early 50s, they built a ton of new houses, and the population soared. And so they were constantly building new houses. By the 60s and 70s, when Japan was going through its real economic boom, or starting to, earthquake-proof houses were so much better than the old ones that there was no point in keeping a house. If you were going to get a new house, you both had the money and you needed a better house because the old ones were kind of cheap. And so it sort of created this culture of build a new house because the old houses are not worth keeping. That's pretty much stayed till this day. People have just started being willing to buy and live in used houses. I read an article that said most European countries, people live in used houses about 60 to 90% of the time. In Japan, about 10% of people live in used houses. So that alone is like, whoa, it's almost completely opposite. It's not part of the culture, and it's just more normal to rebuild a house entirely.
Well, they don't want to live in houses that someone else has lived in. Do houses get torn down and new houses built on the spot? Like, what happens? Are these houses vacated because the occupants died or just moved? Or I guess my question is, why do people stop living in these houses, and what happens to them when they stop living there? If I didn't want to live in this house and I just moved to a new house, I would still have to pay taxes on this house.
Right. I think in general, what happens is a lot of the time the people who live in the house die and the house goes to a child or an heir or something. And I'm not sure how property taxes work here, but they must not be very bad because I know multiple people who own a house here and don't live here in this area. And they don't destroy it, they don't sell it, they just leave it, which is strange to me. But since no one's going to live in the used house, the only way to make that place valuable again is to destroy the house and then build something new there, which means its value is only in the land that the house is sitting on, but there's a cost of destroying the house that's subtracting from the land value, and you have to build a new house on top of it. So the house itself is actually like a negative asset in a lot of cases. And in Japan, about 13% of all houses are vacant.
See, the entrepreneur in me is like, vacant houses. I could Airbnb, like, I could have an empire.
See, you would think that, maybe I have a picture or two of what some of these vacant houses look like, but if you can imagine, like, an old barn where there's, like, old farm equipment just sitting there, but a house, like, the houses aren't emptied out. They're still full of stuff and rusted things. It gets moldy because no one's taking care of it. There's water damage.
Yep.
And so the house is like basically worth nothing. And so all you're left with is a structure that has to be taken down, leveled out, and then something new put on top of it.
Now, they don't have basements there.
No.
Okay.
I don't think earthquakes let you build a basement easily or cheaply, plus flooding. So they don't do that. Basically, you're looking at about 30 years before a house is considered like old and might get torn down and replaced with something new.
That's a very short lifespan.
Right, but you know, most Japanese people live with their parents until mid-30s, early 30s, unless they get married before then.
Huh.
So if you move out into a new house at 30, or 35, you're like 65, and maybe you want to retire and go to a different house at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So you're looking at 30 years for a house. And what that means is, since a house is not something you buy and renovate and live with, but it's more of a short-term asset that's eventually going to be worth less than the land it's sitting on, they cut corners in housing a lot here. This might be because of like fire issues or something, but they don't insulate walls pretty much anywhere. The walls are very thin and uninsulated. They don't have a grounded plug for their electrical outlets for the most part. So usually just the air conditioner and maybe the washing machine will have a grounded outlet plug where you stick an extra green wire into the ground. But from what I've heard, a lot of those grounds aren't actually connected to anything. They're just there so that you can do something with the extra wire, because it costs a lot of extra money and time to set up the grounded thing properly. Which to me is terrifying because
Yeah.
that's not how we do stuff in the US.
Well, they're 220 volts, aren't they, for everything?
110 or 120 depending on, or no, it's 120, but the hertz is different depending on which side of the country you're on.
Okay, so
Isn't that great?
Of course.
I had an interesting conversation with one of the old men that I'm friends with in town, and he asked me what we do about vacant houses in America. And I didn't really know how to answer it because I feel like we don't have that many vacant houses in America. Like, you're going to sell it.
Yeah.
Or you're going to sell the land it's on because it's worth a lot of money and there's no point in paying property tax on something you're not using. Yeah, it was an interesting conversation just because, I don't know, we don't have that. But vacant houses are definitely a thing here. It's fun to walk around at night and try and figure out which houses are still occupied and which ones aren't by looking if their lights are on. Like, we have a house just down the road where the front door had a giant spider web on it. Like, you would not have been able to open the door without knocking out the spider web. But there was a car in front of it that would sometimes be gone and sometimes be there. And we could not figure out if someone actually lived there or was just using it as a parking space. But then we realized there was a secret entrance around back. So we're pretty sure someone lives there.
It's interesting to hear a lot of this because I feel in some ways China's the same way, but maybe for different reasons. I don't know if you saw, there was a post on Reddit a while back, a couple weeks ago, talking about the housing bubble in China.
Right, I did see that.
And that had a lot of good info. I didn't fact check any of it, but from my experiences in China, it all sounds like it's fairly solid explanations and reasoning on that stuff. But yeah, the biggest thing that shocked me living in China was the lack of insulation. I'm going over to China and I'm in the south. I'm in along the southern coast of China, and I'm basically being told by people, most of them foreigners, not maybe so much Chinese, but I'm more or less told that the city is far enough south that the government has said we don't need heaters, and so heating units are outlawed. Now, almost all of the air conditioning units also had heater functions, so I'm not entirely sure this was true, but they also didn't work very well. So
yeah, we have the same kind of like up on the wall rectangular air conditioners that don't heat very well. Yeah, so in the US, when you have a house, usually you have central air and a furnace. So you have a heater that blows air, or maybe you have a radiator or whatever, but you have a system that heats the entire house. Yes.
And occasionally you have maybe an air conditioner in a window, like a window air conditioner that just is mainly for one room.
Yes.
In China, and I know this was at your house too in Japan, there's this little long rectangular unit that's an air conditioning unit that hangs up by the ceiling, and there's one in the living room, and there's one in the dining room, and there's one in every bedroom, and they're all operated by a remote, and they're all separate.
Yep.
And just to have this concept where it's like every room has its own temperature control is both kind of nice because we didn't spend time in the living room. It's the largest room in the house. We just said, no, we're not going to air condition that room. You can air condition your bedrooms. But at the same time, every room in this building is this concrete block
Mhm.
with no insulation. So it's like any cooling you do is going to be very temporary.
Yeah, Japan's the same way. And the funny thing about Japan is every winter, at the beginning of winter, they sell all sorts of things to help try and keep your house warm. We have these things in the windows that stand like maybe 3 feet tall, and it's like insulation. So you just stand it up in your windowsill, and then it blocks some of the cold air coming in, because you can feel cold air pouring through the big wall windows. And you can buy it hand warmers in like 30 packs, so you can use those every day. They
Yep.
use space heaters a lot. Like pretty much everyone uses some kind of space heater or propane heater. Kerosene. Kerosene heaters are big if you love the smell of kerosene in your house. And then all sorts of blankets and other things. The kotatsu is also big, where it's like a low table that has basically a thick quilted blanket over it.
Mhm.
And then there's a heater underneath that you turn on and you stick your feet under. And I don't know, it seems silly to me that you're paying for stuff like kerosene heat and insulated window treatments and stuff, but there's nothing in the walls.
Mhm.
I don't know, I feel like that would be my first avenue of trying to keep heat in my house, would be stopping it from pouring out of every single contact point with the outside world.
Yeah. Now, you're in an area that's right by the shore, and it's far enough north that you actually do get a little bit of snow, and it does kind of get
Yes.
cold there. How cold does it get?
It usually doesn't get much below freezing.
Okay.
I think our coldest day was maybe 20 degrees? 20 at the coldest for sure.
And that's
Um,
Fahrenheit
Fahrenheit.
for everyone
In-
listening.
In Minnesota, 20 degrees Fahrenheit's like, that's not cold. Whatever. Wear a coat. You're fine. Because we have insulation and furnaces, and when you go outside, you know that you can always just go back inside and it will be warm inside.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's 20 degrees, the inside of our house in like the kitchen area could be as cold as 35 or 38 degrees when we wake up in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's chilly. When your indoor temperature is below 40 degrees and you feel like wearing a coat inside, that's culture shock.
Yeah. In Zhuhai, the temperature actually didn't get much colder than 40. Like 45 was maybe some of the coldest days. So from a standpoint of living in Minnesota, it's like it was warm all year round, but it was also humid all year round. And when you went inside, it was also still 40 degrees because you're in this concrete box and there's no source of heat that's going to keep you warm.
Right.
Or keep this space warm. Because in addition to having concrete walls with no insulation, half of the walls are giant windows.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's even lets more through. So I was constantly battling cool, moist air. And so it's like, okay, I don't want anything in my room to start molding. So I'm trying to run the air conditioning or the dehumidifier function of the air conditioning to like get rid of the moisture. But that's also cooling down the air.
Right.
What you said is exactly true. You're like, oh, it's not cold. You just go inside and warm up. It's like, no, you go inside and you're the same temperature. It's actually probably colder in your room, in your house, than it is outside sometimes.
Yeah, because of the sun.
Yeah, there's no getting away from it. So you like continually bundle up more and put little heat packets in your gloves or on your feet. I had some nice ones that would stick to my shirt.
Oh yeah, we everywhere where you can buy them, there's the stick and non-stick versions here, and there's some for your shoes. They're designed to slide into the top of your shoes. So in Japan, they have this thing called a genkan,
Okay.
which they love to play up as something super Japanese, but we basically have it too. It's called a mudroom. The big difference is that there's a step up, and you never ever ever step up to the actual floor of your house without taking off your shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true pretty much everywhere. You go to the community center, you're going to take off your shoes and put on indoor shoes. You go to the hospital or the clinic, you might take off your shoes and put on indoor shoes, which they provide for you. I was just wondering if China has something similar with a Genkan style thing where you come in, you take off your outdoor shoes, you slip on your indoor shoes.
No.
Nope.
I'm trying to think. I went to a couple people's houses here and there. Most of them didn't.
Okay. Yeah, even in small, like, one-room apartments, when Haley and I would do an Airbnb or something, there'd be, like, an inch step up, and the Airbnb people would always be like, please take off your shoes and wear the indoor shoes in our apartment. You foreigners who don't know our rules. I'm actually wearing indoor shoes right now. I think the custom came into play because the floor is 30 degrees.
Yeah. I wear indoor shoes at my house in Minnesota. They're just called, I just call them slippers. And they're to keep my feet warm.
Oh, I wish mine had coverings for the toes. Mine are more like sandals made of cloth. Actually, these are the only indoor shoes in the entire country that I have found that fit me. The local trial store had one pair of LL slippers. Everywhere else I go, I can't find another pair of LLs. So I'm stuck with these, which are like falling apart and covered in what I assume are coffee stains. Oh, here's another thing that's different about Japanese houses.
Yes.
The shower room is never the same room as the toilet room in any house that isn't, like, cheap. For the most part, your shower room and bathroom are going to be separate. Hotels, it's usually a little different, but the shower room is always, even if the toilet's in there, is always a plastic box. I don't know why they do that, but they love to do that.
Your little water closet, it basically just has a toilet. And I think my favorite feature of that small little space is that the hand washing faucet is right on the top of the toilet. So it's all of the water filling the tank can be used to clean your hands ahead of time. It's really cold water, but I think that's a really clever space-saving technique.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the best parts about the toilet faucet is that when it's 30 degrees outside and you're freezing in the toilet room, you get to wash your hands with water that just came from outside. Which is another interesting quirk about Japanese houses, is they generally do not have automatically heated water. You have to turn your water heater on and off.
Which is, I assume, for cost savings? Electricity savings?
Yeah, I think it is too. I'm not sure how much money you save by turning it off and on. Probably a decent amount. It bugged me a lot when we first got here as an American, where I'm like, you mean I have to press a button and wait for a minute to get hot water? This offends me and my American ideals. But given that we're now paying money for heated water, it's sort of nice to be like, well, we're at least not paying for it when we aren't using it.
The water faucet, or the water heaters in our apartment, were on the far end of the apartment from where my bathroom was. We had two on the walls, and I think one went to each bathroom, and it heated up the water as you went. Like, it didn't have a tank that I could tell. And it had a summer mode and a winter mode, and I always left it on winter mode, because if you turned it on to summer mode, it did not heat up the water very hot, and the hot water did not last very long. The house I lived in, or the apartment I lived in, was actually larger than my house here in the States.
Really?
It helped that there were 3 interns living in one space. So it was a 3-bedroom apartment. And my bedroom there was much, much larger than my bedroom here. And the living room, dining room area was also this really big place. I mean, it must have been 30 or so feet at least by 20 feet. So,
oh wow!
It was this huge open space. The floor was some sort of granite tile, seamless tile, and the walls were all white and plastered with some sort of thin plaster which was water soluble. If there's occasional like chips and cracks, and when pieces would fall off, we would take them and dunk them in water, and it would just kind of dissolve into nothing.
Wow. Well, that's one way to plaster a wall.
Yeah, but I mean, my understanding is that kind of like Japan, the Chinese people, when they get an apartment, they want it to be theirs, so they'll just gut what is there and just start over. So the only things kind of in the wall are electricity. You strip it down to the concrete and you build it back up. I was invited to a potluck at the director of our division department house, and she lived about an hour from campus. I don't know if she drove. Like, she might have hired someone to drive her every day.
Oh wow.
I'm not entirely sure. Getting there was fun because the section of the road was unfinished, So
Mhm.
like you have buses and other cars just going along this highway and then just getting onto like a dirt road with huge potholes and then transitioning over to the other section of the highway. Like this section of highway, I went over this 2 or 3 times over the course of a year and a half, and it was never finished. I went to her house, and she had like a 3-story townhouse.
Oh, wow.
The middle and upper floors, I think she had filled one room, like she had her bedroom and maybe a guest room with a bed in it, but it was all very empty.
Hmm.
She lived alone, I think. But it was a really expensive house. Oh, so this is something I wanted to say.
Okay.
Traveling through China, we had several tour guides who were talking to us like in Beijing and other places, and they always wanted to stress how expensive these places were to live. And they would talk about how this house costs how many $1,000 per square meter.
Mm-hmm.
Or some statistic like this. And I never really knew what they meant because as an American, I measure houses in square feet.
Yes.
And a square meter isn't even comparable to a square yard. I mean, that's as close as I can get, but it's not quite accurate. And they always talked about the money. I never felt like I knew which currency they were talking in. Because sometimes they would make it sound like it was dollars, and sometimes it would sound like it was Chinese money. And I'm like, I don't know if I should be impressed by this or not. So it was very strange to hear this, but because they're talking like these really small apartments that cost a lot of. It's like a small apartment. It costs a lot, and it's like I have no point of reference for what this actually means.
Yeah, I was looking up stats for Japan before our talk, and there were all these numbers, and I was like, wow, that seems really expensive for that square meterage. And then at the end, it was like, Japan is relatively cheap among in terms of large city cost per square meter. And I was like, oh, I guess that's not very expensive. Oh, yeah. One more thing about Japanese houses. In general, quite a few Japanese houses still have what they call a washitsu, which is literally a Japanese room.
Mm.
And so it's got a tatami rice mat floor.
Mm-hmm.
Usually some slidey doors, some low tables that you have to kneel at so you can barely reach it. Yeah, I just think it's interesting that even in these modern houses, like our apartment does not have one, presumably because they didn't think a foreign American would want one.
Mm-hmm.
But the apartment building right next to ours, half the house is a tatami room. And it's just interesting to me that it's still considered a pretty essential part of a lot of people's housing, especially since a lot of people sleep in them on the floor with a futon cover. And yeah. I feel like I had more to say about that, but I lost it somewhere in the middle. So there's your fun fact of the day. They still use washitsu.
Oh, that is kind of cool. Wish I had a room for a Japanese room. Most Chinese people live in apartments and tall towers, like skyscrapers, apartment towers. You just never saw freestanding houses. Even when we would go to more quote-unquote ancient sections of town, people would still be in houses all kind of close to each other within the same larger structure.
Right.
Did I talk about Bruce Lee's ancestral home?
No, you did not. That sounds interesting.
I would go on tours, day trips with the college to these different folk areas or museums or other cultural aspects. And there were 2 types of house you would kind of go to. One would be some sort of building that would be like a larger mansion that someone famous had, and it would have all these different houses and courtyards and different rooms. And all the rooms would always be, 10 foot by 10 foot max. And it's stone, no insulation. It might be brick, but little hard furniture, small windows, and almost all of them are open air. Not much in terms of doors closing them out. And so while my modern apartment I was living in was really large, a lot of houses I think are a lot smaller. And so one day we went to the ancestral home of Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was a film star of sorts in America. He never actually lived in China. At least he never lived in this house in China.
But it's his ancestral home.
But his ancestors lived in this house in China. So the bus parks, and there's some sort of karate school with some statues and a basketball court off to the behind us. And we start walking down this road, and it's this narrow concrete street with the buildings at least 1 or 2 stories high on either side, a few gates and openings here and there, basically brick walls to either side. And after a couple 100 feet, there's a small little doorway on the side, and there's a plaque next to it that says, "This is the ancestral home of Bruce Lee." And you walk inside the door. I didn't even remember if there was a door or it was just an opening in the wall. But it's a small room. It's probably 8 by 8. Actually, it's probably closer to 6 by 6. And this is the kitchen. So you walk right into the kitchen. There's a small little stone stove where they would have a wok or some pots and have a fire underneath it, and I think a vent up and out the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
This is just 1 story tall here. The kitchen has an open doorway into the next space, which is about maybe a 10 foot by 10 foot or 8 foot by 8 foot courtyard. It's open to the air above. And it's just this concrete courtyard. There's maybe a few plants there, maybe a drain, I think, so that water wouldn't accumulate. Just brick walls to the sides with another open door opening to the left. And this is the biggest room in the house, and it is maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, 12 by 12 max. I don't think it was even that big. Probably 9 to 10 feet square. And again, brick room, 1 story tall, maybe a little bit, story and a half. I don't remember what the ceiling was like in this spot. But they had pictures on the wall of Bruce Lee and a punching bag in the corner, and there's no furniture except maybe a table. And just a space, and then almost immediately to the left is 1 more door to 1 more room, and this room is maybe 10 feet long. It's about as long as this main room is, but it's as narrow, like its width is closer to the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe like 6 by 10 or something like that. And there's a large wooden bed against the far wall, and the bed is only like 4.5 feet long. Like, these people were short that lived in, and it's the traditional bed, so it's got large bedposts, and it used to have like curtains that would come over it and stuff like that. And I think there was maybe a dresser or some sort of other chair or furniture in this room. I also noticed in this bedroom that it was a concrete wall that had lines painted on it to look like brick. And I don't remember if I've mentioned this in the podcast or not, but I would oftentimes find a brick or a concrete wall that had little white lines painted so it looked like brick. The thing with this wall, though, is you could still see the red chalk lines and the pencil marks that they had drawn.
Oh, wow.
Because they had chalk lines going from top to bottom to keep the brick straight. But the bricks are offset, so there'd be like a line from a brick, and then the square of the brick and a red line would go right through the middle of it. But that is the entirety of the house.
Tiny.
Yeah, it's very tiny. It's like the whole floor plan is just a couple 100 square feet at most. But this is, I feel like this is very typical about how many of the ancient houses were in the cities.
I guess that's not super surprising given China's extremely large population, even before the modern era. Not a ton of space for anyone. Your description of the kitchen area is pretty much spot on to the exact same thing at traditional Japanese houses here. Like in our area, the oldest house in the region is the Kawamoto house, which was built in the 1600s, I believe. That has a kitchen area, and the Japanese word for kitchen is daidokoro, which means standing area. And I never really understood why it was called that until seeing a traditional kitchen area, because you would not want to sit down there. It's got like a flattened dirt floor, probably covered with some soot from the kitchen fire.
You were mentioning that it's hard to tell what houses are vacant and which ones aren't. Like, do people actually live there? And in some of the older and smaller villages that we did visit, I had a very similar feeling, where this place looks like it might not be inhabited, but it might be too. Walls are falling down, doors, there either are no doors or they don't close properly, or maybe they are locked up and it looks like it's rusted shut. It's like, you can't actually tell if people live there or not, because there's 8 dozen electrical wires that run into the wall at various points.
Yeah.
But no other signs of habitation.
Yeah, there's like those signs that would tell you as an American that no one lives there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case.
Yeah. Because then you come through at other times and there's houses that look like they should be abandoned and there's people like sitting out in front of them. Is that everything we got?
I think so. I don't know if I have anything else to say about Japanese houses.
We don't pad out these episodes with filler shows of nothing but screaming and yelling and charging up.
But maybe we should. I don't know, can you hear me charging up right now?
I can hear you charging up right now. Next week, find out if Luke can charge up enough.
I don't know anything about living in houses.